Sometimes in digital photography there's just too much detail, and what we'd like is smoother tones. If I take a look at this image and zoom in, I'll just select the zoom tool and zoom in on a portion of this skin here. We can see that we have quite a lot of detail. And what I'd like to create in this project is smoother surfaces to this project, but hold on to the crisp detail that we might see in the eyes. Okay, so I'll just zoom back out to fit on screen. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to open this image as an object. You can see I've made a few small changes to this state of this image from the raw defaults here. I've increased the white slider to +60. If you have set the defaults to this image again, then you'll also find that there's a snapshot in the snapshots project, so you can just click on this start of project to get to this view. Okay, now if you don't see the Open Object button, then what I recommend you do is to click on the workflow options and check this Open in Photoshop as Smart Objects option here. Alternatively, you can just hold down the Shift key to access the Open Object button. I'm going to click on this to open it into the main editing space of Photoshop. And before we start, I'm going to right click on the Smart Object layer and choose New Smart Object via Copy. This is different from just duplicating it by dragging it to the new layer icon or using the keyboard shortcut Ctrl J or Command J, because this won't do what we're looking to do here. Okay, now what we're going to do from this project is we're going to apply some Gaussian blur. Okay, so from the filter menu we'll come up to blur and then choose Gaussian blur. I'm going to choose a radius of about 10 pixels for this particular image. You could take this slightly higher depending on the resolution of the image and how large the surfaces are within your image. Okay, I'm going to start with 10 pixels. We can adjust this later because this will be applied as a smart filter. Okay, now we're losing all of the fine detail at the moment, even though we're creating smoother surfaces with that Gaussian blur. So I'm going to blend the Gaussian blur filter back into the sharp pixels. And we can do this by selecting the blending options, just by double clicking that icon on the smart filter there, and then change the mode to one of the contrast blend modes, such as overlay. Okay, and then we'll select OK. Now, although we're mixing in those smoother tones from the Gaussian blur with the fine detail, we're getting a few side effects from this, and one of those is increased contrast and the second is increased saturation. So we're going to manage those by double clicking on the smart object to return to Adobe Camera Raw. Okay, with the image back inside of Adobe Camera Raw, these are the original settings that we started with. And what I'm going to do to compensate for that contrast and increase in saturation is make some adjustments here. So we're going to take the contrast slider down to -50. And we're going to take the highlight slider down to -75. And also we're going to take the shadows up to +75. Now, if you've already made some adjustments or different settings to a different image, these are relative settings. So if your contrast had been set at +50, then you'll just zero it, i.e. take away 50, rather than taking it down to -50. Okay, we're also going to deal with the increased saturation by taking the saturation slider down to approximately -30. And then we'll apply those settings. At the moment you can see it's looking very low in contrast and saturation, but this will compensate for that blending mode that we applied earlier. So I'll simply select OK. This will update the preview, and as you can see now we return to the normal saturation, but now we have smoother tones. And again, if I zoom in on an area of that image, you'll see that we have quite a lot of smoother tones there. Okay, so what we'll do now is we're going to apply a couple of additional filters. We're losing some of the darkest shadow details still here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in to Image, Adjustments, and then bring up the Shadow Highlights Adjustment feature. This can be applied as a smart filter as well. Typically this dialog box will open in the collapse view, okay, and so what you'll often need to do is click on the Show More options here. Now the default settings is quite aggressive here, so I'm going to take the amount down to 25 and take the tonal width down to a low 15. This means that we'll just be affecting the darkest shadow tones within the image. Okay, so down here, for instance, if we click on and off the preview, you'll see a before and after. This is before the shadow modification, and this restores all of that fine detail in the deepest shadows there. If you find your highlights are perhaps getting just a little bit too bright here, we can also do a similar adjustment with the highlights section of this slider. Just raise the amount, perhaps just to 9 or 10 here, and again take the tonal width down so we're only affecting the absolutely brightest tones. Just raise that a little bit more, and again we can see a before and after. Okay, so just bringing those highlights down a fraction there, but opening up the shadows significantly. And I'll select OK to apply that shadow highlights, and as you can see again it's applied as a smart filter. Okay, what I'm going to do now is apply one last smart filter, and that is to sharpen the fine detail. Let's just zoom in around the eye here. I'll just zoom in until I'm about 50% here so we can see the detail I'm about to sharpen. You can see the beautiful smooth tones we're creating here. Okay, again I'll just click on and off this modified smart object layer so we can see a before and after to see those smoother tones that we've created. And now we're going to restore the sharpness but leave those smoother tones in place, and we'll do that with filter, sharpen, and we'll choose smart sharpen. Now this smart sharpen dialog box can be resized. Okay, we don't have to accept the small default preview, we can just drag this out, and so we've got a nice preview to work with. And again I can just come in and center the area that I'm looking to pay attention to. Now the default values will probably be lower than the amount that I've got set here, so I'm raising this to around about 300. And the radius I'm pushing down a little bit lower than normal, down to a value of 0.7. And because we've got the smoother tones in play already, I can set the reduce noise to 0. If you are working with a higher ISO image, then you might want to raise that a little bit. Okay, I'm happy with the sharpness here. We can also toggle between lens blur and Gaussian blur to look for the best quality that we can get for that sharpening. Okay, not a huge amount of difference between those two options in this instance, so I'm just going to select OK. And what we're going to do now is we're going to show that how we can work this effect that we've created in a localized manner. Now if I wanted to cut back through to the base layer, I wouldn't be using this mask, because remember we've modified the settings here, and this would reveal some of the very low contrast, low saturation information on this layer. Okay, let's select the brush tool. I've got black set as the foreground color, and if I right click I can just make sure the hardness of the brush is set to 0. I'll be working with a much larger brush, maybe 200 or 300 pixels in size. Okay. Now we can't work directly on the smart object layer, so we're going to have to add a mask to this layer. So we're going to click on the add layer mask. Okay, and I'll just have to invert those colors because the default for a mask is white as the foreground. So just press the X key or switch those foreground background colors around. Okay, now if I wanted to push through to the information on the lower layer, for instance, what I'm noticing here is the lips on this layer are a little bit smooth for me. I actually like the effect on the skin, but perhaps not on the lips. And you can see we've got a little bit more rich detail on the lips underneath. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that layer mask, and with the brush tool set quite soft, I'm just going to paint into that layer. Okay, and as you can see we can start revealing some of that better information or more detailed information on the underlying layer. And just to show you before and after, I'm going to hold down the shift key and click on that layer mask so you can see how we've restored detail in that area. Now in the eyes, if I just zoom in so you can see the detail in the eyes, we actually have very good detail in those eyes. We can try cutting back to the underlying layer if you feel that you just need a little bit more of that underlying information. Okay, but we're actually that Smart Sharpen on this layer is actually doing a quite effective layer. So I'm going to leave that unmasked in this instance, and I'll just do Command 0 on a Mac or Control 0 to fit on screen, and that gives me the smoother tones that I was looking to create inside of this image project.